Hi, I'm Mike Doran.
And I'm Peter Rao.
Welcome back to Counterbalance.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun. Yes, and today our guest on Counterbalance is Peter Rao, my co-host. My co-host is my guest. Peter just got back from...
There's something deeply philosophical about that, both guest and host at the same time.
My mind can't even really fully comprehend it. I'm afraid if I spend too much time thinking about it, steam will come out of my ears. Let's. What was I saying? Oh yes, you just got back from Taiwan, and you found it revelatory. And so I thought we'd have a conversation with you about your Taiwan trip. First of all, just welcome, Peter.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to have you. Why don't you just give us some of your what's the word I'm looking for?
Impressions?
Impressions. Give us some of your impressions of your trip to Taiwan.
Well, as a Europeanist who flies a lot across the Atlantic, it really begins with flying across the Pacific, because crossing the international date line is a fascinating experience.
Hold on,
in and of itself.
Your big insight is that it's very far away.
Well, no, it's that when you cross the date line, you either leap forward into tomorrow, or on your flight back, you jump into yesterday. So my ticket in Taipei had me taking off from Taipei 30 minutes before I took off in San Francisco onward to Washington on the way back. And that is sort of a mind pretzel that I found interesting. But also on the flight, I think my first real insight, sitting there at one point, I woke up and I look out and I see Osaka, Japan down below, just south of Tokyo on the main island. And then I looked at those flight monitor displays they have where they show distance to destination, altitude, and all the rest. And it was something like 2.5 hours to Taipei. And when you fly into Taiwan, into Taipei being in the northern part of Taiwan, really almost on approach, you still see the last southernmost Japanese islands. And so Japan looms very large in the strategic consciousness of the Taiwanese. We heard that after Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August 2022, when the PRC really picked up its saber rattling and we can almost call it outright military aggression against Taiwan, there have been opinion polls showing the Japanese as the top most reliable strategic partner in the minds of the Taiwanese, and much more so than, say, the Philippines, which is just south of Taiwan. The Philippines are geographically connected, but they really don't come up in discussion in the same way. In fact, if you think back to World War II, Taiwan is from where the Japanese launched that famous raid on Clark Air Base in the hours after Pearl Harbor, for which General MacArthur and Sutherland, his aide-de-camp, were later chastised because they didn't disperse the bomber fleet in time. So you would think that the Philippines would play a major role in Taiwanese thinking, but it's really the Japanese. And I'd also add there, the Taiwanese tend to vacation more in Japan, it seems, than the Philippines. The DPP had just won the presidential election a few weeks ago, and so campaign headquarters had emptied out, and where did the staff go on vacation?
This is kind of
Japan.
This is kind of the simple thing that anyone who's from Taiwan or goes there a lot would know, but you can't know unless you go.
Totally, yeah.
I didn't know that, for example. Not that I'm the world's greatest expert on.
Yeah.
But so when
but the implication also being that, given those islands are so close, in any even blockade scenario, I don't know how you run a military blockade against Taiwan without also cordoning off some of the Japanese island. And I think the Taiwanese believe that hopefully the United States, but also the Japanese, would be there in extremis. And the assumption for the Philippines is that it might provide basing for the U.S., but nothing more.
So let's stick on this for a little bit.
Let's not, because I'm a Europeanist, and so I'm very superficially informed on this. But no, I kid. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, but I believe that if you spend less than a week in a place, then you're really the world's greatest expert.
That's right.
Because you don't have enough information to have doubts about anything. You have strong impressions, but no doubt. But so, is it your impression that when Taiwanese make decisions and they're thinking about the impact internationally, are they thinking as much about the Japanese as the Americans?
I think they just view the U.S. and Japan as the two big players in the region, both of which are on Taiwan's side. And so they're not really prepared to offend the Japanese or the Americans. Taiwan, we were in the foreign ministry, and there are only a few flags left out front for official recognition. They're constantly fighting off isolation and PRC attempts to box them out of the international system. And so anything they can do to generate attention, engagement, access to the outside world matters a great deal. But I would say that Japan and the U.S. are probably, seems like, in a class of their own.
So are the Japan and the United States fully aligned on Taiwan today? Is there any daylight between them?
I think they're pretty closely aligned.
The Japanese, do they make open commitments about the defense of Taiwan in the event that it would be attacked?
I don't know if they've made any public declarations, but I do think I know in private there's more and more recognition that if Taiwan goes, then China kind of blows out into the Western Pacific, and that becomes the PRC opens up into the Western Pacific, and that
they break out of the first island chain.
Becomes a big problem for Japan. So yes, now Taiwan has other cards to play than just the Japan-U.S. alliance, but those are the two major ones. It's clear that if the PRC decided to actually attack Taiwan, its air force and whatever navy it has would probably be destroyed right away. It would still have some land forces, but it has this famous silicon shield, which of course matters. That being
the silicon shield being the fact that it's the leading chip.
It's much more than the leading chip. The TSMC is, I think, the most valuable company in Asia. The Taiwan Semiconductor Company. It also has a smaller UMC and maybe a third or fourth chip making fabrication company that then leads into the integrated circuit engineering, onto the suppliers, then into automobiles, phones, processors, etc. But I think number 2 might be Samsung, third maybe Toyota, and then the Chinese Tencent perhaps in the top market capitalization. But 80% of the world's chips come from Taiwan, and crucially, the very high-end chips, which really TSMC, I think it's worth $600-700 billion of the company. They produce the high-end chips that are going to be important for artificial intelligence and kind of leading-edge technologies that might dominate or decide the economic competition of the future. So if you go into Taiwan and destroy that, you probably... I mean, the Rhodium Group, I think, had a good estimate out. It would sink global GDP by several percent, if not more. But
so you call it the silicon shield. So is there an assumption out there? I was not aware of this, that China will not attack because it would be afraid of destroying that industry?
There is that assumption, but there's also, I suppose, the logic that they can't do without it, and so that they would want it.
Yeah,
but
that's what I would assume.
Right, but if TSMC is destroyed in an invasion scenario,
why would it be destroyed?
Because it might be blown up.
Wouldn't they take care not to do that?
Well, maybe not just the PRC who has that calculus.
I see.
So that's a major factor.
You've got a devious mind.
Well, that's a major factor, and then I think that's in part why the Chinese would prefer almost sort of the Belarus model that the Russians have played out, which is rather than the Ukraine model of having to violently go in because the country is slipping away, to be able to co-opt, subordinate, insinuate yourself sufficiently into Taiwanese society.
Is that, if I ask you to describe China's strategy toward Taiwan, is that what you'd say it is? That the end goal is Russia, Belarus?
The goal is to take over Taiwan, and the preferred strategy, I think, would be to do so peacefully, because it would be less costly, but if necessary, eventually by force.
And what are the stages of that campaign to take over Taiwan peacefully look like?
I'm not sure, but they just suffered a major blow because
the election. The
election was a blow, I think, to the Chinese, to the PRC. This is the
DPP beat the KMT.
That's right. Sounds like the start of a song, but
it
yes.
Does.
And the TPP was the third party running, so it was a bit of a 1992 Perot, Bush, Clinton dynamic. And maybe just to back up.
Yeah, walk us through. So who's the DPP, who's the KMT, and who's the TPP?
Well, it's all connected to Taiwan's history. In every government building, there's a portrait of Sun Yat-sen, And in fact, if you go on, and I just spent a little time looking.
Sun Yat-sen is KMT, am I right?
Sun Yat-sen is the founder of the Chinese state, and this precedes the nationalist communist civil war in China. So if you go on Chinese TV stations, mainland TV stations, which of course are all propaganda, they actually have very nice things to say about Sun Yat-sen. He died in 1925 in Beijing, I think, of liver cancer. But then subsequently, there was, of course, the Civil War, and Chiang Kai-shek, who was not revered on mainland China, led the nationalist forces against the communists, eventually was defeated and retreated to Taiwan. But what's interesting about this, and this all leads up to the question about the elections, at the time, I think Taiwan's population was maybe 6 or 7 million.
So I'm sorry, I'm still back. So Sun Yat-sen, I was not aware of this. Sun Yat-sen is revered, or at least respected, in both mainland China and Taiwan.
Yeah.
He's the common ancestor.
But Chiang Kai-shek is hated on the mainland and also has a mixed legacy in Taiwan.
Because he was defeated by the communists and then repaired to Taiwan.
He repaired to Taiwan with something like 1 million persons, so maybe 500,000 of his military or 600,000 military, and then maybe 400,000 or 500,000, 600,000 civilians. And at the time, the population of Taiwan was 6 or 7 million, I believe. The Japanese had just been kicked out. They themselves had 500,000, maybe or so, Japanese colonialists, which were evicted. And Chiang Kai-shek always thought he would return to the mainland. So not until he really died in the mid-1970s did he give up on that dream, constantly developing plans for an attack on...
So Chiang Kai-shek is the KMT.
He is. He's the KMT.
He's the founder of the KMT.
But he immediately declared martial law, which remained in place until the late 1980s. And so he's disliked by part of Taiwanese society that adheres to the DPP.
I'm sorry, I realized that you had things you wanted, but I never had all this straight in my head, or like I haven't had it straight in my head since I was a freshman in college.
Yeah, so he is KMT, and he is the protector of Chinese culture. Right, China coming across to Taiwan from the mainland and always intending to go back and retake the mainland.
How did the Taiwanese who preceded the arrival of Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT, how did they understand themselves? Would they see themselves as Chinese? And how did they react to 1 million plus KMT people coming and taking over the island?
I don't know. I know there's an indigenous population which has been an issue in Taiwanese politics. But also a lot of mainlanders from like Fujian province just across the strait who have gone to Taiwan separate from the Chiang Kai-shek retreat.
Oh, for no political reason, just economic refugees or economic migrants.
But still, if you do the math, if there's 6 or 7 million Taiwanese at the moment of the retreat, and he brought 1 million persons, you meet a lot of people whose grandfathers were either part of the retreat or part of the civilians that grandmothers and grandfathers that crossed the strait. But the point is, if we talked about the Silicon Shield earlier, there's also a Chinese cultural shield in that Chiang Kai-shek took all of the marvels of Chinese history, the art, the gold as well, by the way, and brought them to Taiwan. So there's a museum in Taipei which has unbelievable works of Chinese cultural jewels, from pottery to calligraphy, etc. So it's a
Are
bit
these like the Elgin marbles to the Chinese? Do they
totally? And there's a bit of a Hamas thought that crossed my mind. This could be a hospital underneath which you emplace some of your most important military installations, because the theory is the mainlanders would never bomb that museum because of how valuable and precious it is to Chinese history.
Yeah, it's time to build a military installation there.
That's right.
Your mind is very devious.
Yeah. So anyways, so Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT that therefore have always been the guardians of China, and they consider themselves wholly Chinese. And they ruled Taiwan for decades. And more recently, the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, has, I think, under Chen Shu-bian in 2000, won their first presidential election. They are, as the name implies, Democratic Progressive Party. They are anti-death penalty, pro-nuclear, anti-nuclear power, but also...
so they're when they say they're progressive means progressive as we understand it?
But it also means they believe much more in and this is this isn't precise, but more of an independent Taiwanese identity. And so there is
this is
enormous
the thing that matters
tension.
the most,
right? And which is why
that's a question.
It is very much so. This is the issue. So the KMT still looks at mainland China as one country, whereas Taiwan believes in its own sovereignty. It's not prepared to entirely cut ties, which would be casus belli for the mainland. But clearly, they believe in an independent identity, and the polls are moving in their direction. Now, elections are fought there, like everywhere, over issues like mortgages and housing and so forth. But this is the third term in a row, which is unprecedented, that the DPP has won the presidency, even though they lost the legislative wand. That's now controlled by the KMT.
Now, if I recall correctly, what I read in the news before the election was in January, right?
So like a month ago, yeah.
And wasn't the KMT claiming that a victory by the DPP would mean war? They stood for good relations with mainland China, with communist China, and they depicted the DPP as the crazies who are going to lead us to conflict. Do I have that right?
Yeah, and that manifests itself in a couple of ways. One is, for example, when the DPP controlled the legislative wand, the parliament, which has some purse strings attached to it, they would fund, like in the National Taiwanese Democracy Fund, democracy programs. The KMT would interpret that fund as much more appropriate for, say, cross-strait relations dialogue, right? And the second is, while daily there are incursions by the PRC, both via warships and planes of the air defense identification zone, and then the warships are sailing close to the waters and really, especially since Speaker Pelosi's visit, upping the ante on almost provoking. I mean, they're not provoking because the Taiwanese aren't going to answer, but really testing the Taiwanese. You don't hear about it that much from the DPP because they don't want to substantiate the KMT charge that they're leading the country to war. And so as a result, you have this rather aggressive posture by the PRC, but you don't feel it really in Taipei.
Oh, interesting. So they both parties have an interest in playing it down.
Right.
The KMT because it wants good relations with the PRC, and there's too many. We have too much alphabet soup here. The Kuomintang because they don't want to harm relations with Beijing, and the Democratic People's Party, is it?
Progressive Party.
The Progressive. Oh, you told us that Democratic Progressive Party. They don't want to play it up because they don't want to substantiate the claim that they are warmongers.
Yeah.
What about bring the TPP into it for us?
The DPP.
No, the TPP.
The TPP, right? Is a small third party.
This is the Ross Perot.
This is Ross Perot, who controls, I think, if I have it right, maybe the mayorship of New Taipei. I could have this entirely wrong, but they actually performed worse where they're in power. But other than that, they were basically just kind of allowing people to project onto them what they wish. But they're a factor insofar that the legislative wand, the parliament, I believe the DPP ended up with 51 seats, the KMT with 54, and you need 57 for a majority. So they were the holder of the keys for the majority, and they flipped it to the KMT. So the KMT controls the parliament, which DPP had lost. They did in the previous administration, or in the current administration, hold the parliament, but they no longer will, which has implications for things like parliamentary exchanges. There's like a big Japanese-Taiwanese parliamentary exchange program. Is there going to be a speaker delegation led to Beijing? These are all open questions because of the KMT's reputation. And maybe just as an anecdote to illustrate this, when I visited KMT headquarters.
So your visit you went to KMT headquarters and to DPP headquarters?
Well, yes.
We
met with. We didn't go to DPP headquarters, but we met with senior DPP and it's public. We went with the president and the president-elect, both of whom are DPP leaders, and then the KMT party chair at KMT headquarters, who had.
So you got to see everybody.
We saw everybody. It really was. I have
Except
to say,
did you see the TPP people as well?
We did not. Yeah, Ross Perot was busy building a wall to Mexico. The loud sucking sound. Did I have that right? But there was a painting above the in the formal meeting room of KMT headquarters, which had Sun Yat-sen in front of a sea of people, and if you look at the sea of people, you realize it's an outline of mainland China. So they are. You would not probably see that at DPP headquarters, I'm guessing, even though we didn't visit, because the connection between Guomindang, KMT, and the mainland is so strong. Whereas
so it
does not exist with DPP.
Let me repeat back to you what I just heard, and you tell me if I got it wrong. The Chiang Kai-shek came to Taiwan when in 1925 or something, 1926.
Chiang Kai-shek after 1947-48.
It wasn't until the complete victory of the. Yeah. Okay, so in the 40s, and at that time, he still harbored hopes of going back and taking over the mainland
until his death.
Until his death in
1975.
1975, but between 1975 and yesterday, the KMT in Taiwan realizes that it's a fantasy that they're actually going to take power on the mainland, but they haven't lost the sense of unity with the mainland, and that's the basis on which they have this desire for. That's the kind of underlying cultural, ideological basis for which they want to have good relations with the mainland, because they feel like we are all one Chinese people.
Yeah, they would, for example, there are theories. It's a little unfair because it's ascribing motives and conjecture, but there are theories that had the mainland offered them in the mid 1990s, so clear that the PRC was not going to go the way of the Soviet Union. Taiwan was not going to be able to invade and victoriously take over Nanking or Beijing. That at that point, had the mainlanders offered them, say, autonomy and KMT rule over Taiwan, that they would have taken a deal like that. But of course that didn't come to pass. And one real manifestation of this is in the infrastructure, because we landed very early in the morning, got to the hotel, it was all dark out, and then the sun comes up, and I'm in the 8th floor of this beautiful hotel overlooking Taipei, and there are modern gleaming skyscrapers. Like Taipei 101 for a brief moment was the tallest building in the world before the Burj Khalifa overtook it. And there are a lot of sort of construction ongoing. It clearly has elements of Singapore in it, but then it also has some rather dilapidated Southeast Asian infrastructure. And part of this I learned is because the KMT never intended to stay in Taiwan. It was always a backwater, and they were waiting for their return. It was a launch pad to get back to the mainland. And only once they realized that this is probably where we're at for good did they begin to really make the economic investments to improve Taiwan. So Taiwan is a mixture between, it's really a country in transition. And if 10 years ago people would have potentially said, well, this is a bit second, third world-like, you wouldn't say that anymore today, but you would still say it's got a bit of a ways to go, despite having, some extraordinary economic assets. And, FDI, I think U.S.-Taiwan FDI has doubled since 2018. I think it's $31 or $32 billion of U.S. FDI into Taiwan, 17 or 18 Taiwanese into the U.S. I mean, it's a growing economy.
But I'm trying to get into the mind of somebody who's 50 years old, born in the 70s, a KMT, you're born to a KMT family. You no longer have any real hope that the KMT is going to take over China, because the PRC is so powerful, and but yet you maintain this affiliation. What does it mean to you today? What are what's the worldview of a 50-year-old who knows that it's impossible to take over? Is it nationalism that's motivating them, and they have the communist Chinese and the KMT, they share a nationalist vision, or is it something else?
It's, I think, nationalist and cultural. I'll just give you one little vignette. It was an on background meeting with a very senior KMT official, and our colleague John Lee, who sits in Sydney,
who's been on before you were co-host guest,
right?
He's been on this podcast. Very, very intelligent.
Very impressive. And he asked of this KMT official, given Australia's experience with the mainland and Australia's attempts to get into dialogue and rapprochement, reach out to PRC, and the PRC response being to slap down the Australians. Why do you believe that if Taiwan were to go the path of dialogue as you've laid it out with the mainland, things would go better? And basically the answer came down to, well, we understand that we're Chinese and you are not.
Okay, so then the follow-up question is, what about Hong Kong? Because Hong Kong was supposed to be. I mean,
I think that's,
if I were Taiwanese, I know nothing about Taiwan, but I would assume that the minute that we go to Belarus, we become Belarus. And the Chinese get their hooks into us, then we're slaves. Basically.
Well, that explains I think that explains in part why TPP is now in its third term, which is unprecedented in Taiwanese history. I mean,
how would you imagine maybe I'm asking too much, but how would you imagine a KMT?
I was there for a week, Mike. You can ask.
Yeah.
I'll tell you. Take you inside the mind.
So explain to me how a KMT person would respond to that.
I don't know. I think they would. I don't know. I think they would say that they can manage it. I don't know.
Yeah,
it's a good question.
But history is littered with the corpses of people who think like this.
Right. Yeah.
When I think of a Middle Eastern analogy, when Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt unified with the Syrians in 1958, it was the Ba'ath Party in Syria that brought him in, and they just assumed that he would need them in order to rule Syria. And he probably did, actually, but nobody can rule Syria anyway, so it's a whole other question. But they didn't even work any of this. It was fascinating to me to see, looking at it, that they didn't even work any of the details out with him.
Yeah,
because they just assumed that he would rely on them so much, and that they were aligned so closely, that their future was secure.
Yeah,
and then he took over, being an Egyptian leader. He wanted to control everything.
Right.
Their unity meant unity under him, and they were immediately subordinated. Another thing I noticed in the news was this New Year's message from Xi Jinping saying that 2024 will be the year of decision. Basically threatening to take over Taiwan by force. Should I read that statement as an effort to influence the Taiwanese election? Was he turning up the heat because he calculated that would actually help out the KMT?
I don't know. I do know that Taiwanese commentators are convinced that the mainland obviously wants to shape their elections, and so there's massive meddling, interference, all the rest. And I suspect, although we didn't get into this too much, that a lot of the techniques that we're going to see in the U.S. in the coming years, if not this election cycle altogether, like I saw a great AI deep fake of Ron DeSantis a few months ago, or you think he's delivering a message and it's really not him. Or you might have seen Putin gave a press conference where Putin asked Putin a question.
No, I haven't seen that.
He was kind of amused, but I think I also would have been sweating if I were the guy who came up with that idea, because he didn't seem entirely thrilled by it. And so there's enormous amounts of meddling. And I imagine, given the links between the mainland and Taiwan, the amount of business exchanges, that country is also shot through by operatives and spies and PRC actors and provocateurs. But in the media, so there's a back and forth. Some have argued that message she sought to deliver is not all that different than past messages, and so he didn't really put a timestamp on it. He always urges in every meeting with Biden or in these addresses that reunification is coming, and decisions will be taken. But I read that whole speech. I didn't think it as alarmist as maybe it got reported out, but I could be. I mean, again, I'm not an expert on Chinese affairs.
What have the Chinese responses been to the DPP victory?
Well, it hasn't changed. I mean, they're of course probing, but they've been probing since the Pelosi visit in ways that they were not before. I think the real marker to look for is President Lai's inauguration speech, which is considered to be a major policy speech, very important one. So when we went with President Lai, I took the opportunity to ask him what he's going to say in his inauguration speech, and he answered I'm on a tour of the island now, visiting all of my voters, and so in a way, it won't even be my speech; it'll be the voice of the people. And I thought that is a politician.
He's a real politician
par excellence.
He's a real politician.
And then of course he.
This is actually a real democratic country.
Yeah, right? I thought to myself that was beautifully. Bill Clinton, Tony Blair, they'd be proud. George W. Bush, but. Other than that, I didn't get anything out of him. So, but it's considered to be something
he didn't give you the secrets
that they'll be watching, and I think it'll be an intense moment in Cross-strait.
When is that happening?
In May. They have a very long transition period.
Wow.
Yeah, surprisingly long.
Huh. Okay, so we'll wait for May for that. Were they how? Why don't you give us your impressions of? Main impressions about how they were discussing the China threat. What were the main themes that they were developing with you? I'm talking about the DPP.
Well, I'm not sure there's anything I can say there that's appropriate for me to say. I would say that in general, the country is very focused on trying to preserve the status quo because they like their lives, and it's a democracy, and it's economically growing and viable. And the question is whether or not maintaining stability allows you to keep the status quo, or whether or not China, through salami slicing tactics, is not so encroaching on the Taiwanese ability to maneuver and exist that it begins to choke off Taiwan. I think they're not at that point. They're not quite like dramatically alarmed by it, but clearly China continues to change the rules and the baseline and shift the Overton window, if you will. Just while we were there, there was a major story in the Taipei Times how the Chinese had reneged on an agreement they had negotiated over flight patterns in the Taiwan Straits related to those two outlying islands, Kinmen and Matsu, that are right up against the mainland. And so that was just another small example to which the West essentially makes no response, but then changes the status quo. And, just to maybe offer an alternative to that, the U.S.-Philippine Defense Treaty, we publicly stated, I believe it was Secretary Pompeo, covers some of the disputed islands between the Philippines and what PRC disputes. And so that's a flashpoint, but I think there's at least some informed opinion in Taiwan that believes there won't be a Philippine-Chinese war because the U.S. has offered that defense guarantee. Yeah. Which then begs the question, why are they so comfortable with strategic ambiguity, or aren't they, when it comes to U.S. policy on Taiwan? I don't think that they want us talking about those issues too much because it...
Who's the they?
The Taiwanese.
Yeah.
I'd say that's probably the opinion of society. But, and then,
Like, don't... just make sure I understand what you're saying. Their attitude is, don't poke the bear.
Don't poke the dragon, yeah.
The dragon. Don't poke the dragon.
And don't rattle the cage because he might break out or burn us with just fire. Right. And it's still, while prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, some 80% of Taiwanese public did not think that a war was anywhere on the horizon. That's after the invasion of Ukraine somewhere in the 60s. That still means like keep the status quo because we're not facing a war, but it does suggest there's some unease in society.
So what are your what's the biggest thing you learned on this trip? Thing that really your single biggest...
The Pacific's a big ocean.
Wow.
I'm a little bit one thing that's also interesting, which I suppose I should have known, but Taiwan takes the same views on the South China Sea essentially as the mainland.
Sometimes this is what I like about travel, is that sometimes there are things that are really kind of obvious and that you know from looking at the map. For instance, I actually know that Taiwan is close to Japan, but when you actually go to a place and you interact with people, it means much more to you than just knowing it. You can weave that understanding into your interpretation of what's happening.
I'd say one major takeaway is that for Taiwan to survive, if it came to war, it would require the United States. That's an obvious point. But what I didn't appreciate is that Taiwan exercises its military unilaterally, not with the U.S., because again, the mainland would consider that rather provocative, nor do they exercise with, say the Japanese self-defense forces. So if Taiwan's strategy is, all right, in the opening day of a war, our Air Force is destroyed, or it's hard to maintain that, and we're going to struggle at sea, even though they're putting submarines into the waters now. I think they just have an indigenous submarine program. Again, a question if the KMT keeps that going. But if the point is you have to fight with the Americans, unlike NATO, which is totally interoperable, there are going to be some, I think, coordination challenges between the U.S. and Taiwan. And that self-imposed, perhaps wise, perhaps unwise, limitation on
and if
the military
if they changed
matters.
it now and started, that would be a major provocation to the PRC.
Right. Whereas if we had been doing it since, say, the Eisenhower days, it would just probably be considered
just be normal.
What we do, right? I mean, the North Koreans throw a huff when we run exercises with the South Koreans, but that's just the way it's been done, minus the brief pause when President Trump was in office.
Okay, let's imagine that that China and the United States go to war over the Philippines. What's the position of the KMT?
I don't know, and that thought occurred to me. On the one hand, they need the U.S. because the U.S. is its security guarantor, and without the U.S., Taiwan is gone. On the other hand,
I'm talking about the KMT.
This is the KMT's calculus, though, too. The KMT recognizes that Taiwan does not exist without the U.S. I mean, they're oblivious to that fact, and
right.
they understand that. On the other hand, they also are Chinese and not Filipino, and so if the U.S. lost that war,
is it your sense that they would actually have divided loyalty? Would there be would it cause unease for them?
I suspect they're just wouldn't. I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, the other open question.
So it's not a silly question. There is a possibility that nationalist sentiment, Chinese nationalist sentiment, would actually play a role in there.
It could be. I mean, we met with Eric Chu, the head of the KMT. This could be a totally silly question, and I could have asked it, and he would have just immediately answered and batted away. I just don't know enough. But it's a conundrum that occurred to me, and but I didn't ask it in that meeting. The other question I have, which is just because again I'm not steeped in these issues. Given that 40 or 50% of the world's tanker traffic flows through the Taiwan Straits, I mentioned this to you the other day, I don't know if you can actually run a war without previously alerting commercial traffic that they have to stay out of the strait. I mean, when I vacation in North Carolina in the summer, I see tankers on the horizon every few minutes. That's nothing compared to the tanker traffic, presumably, in the Taiwan Straits. Or are you just sailing one day with your freight to Shanghai and you're like, there's an amphibious landing taking place in a military action?
Well,
the Russians alerted the Black Sea. They regularly shut down the Black Sea through exercises and then shut down the northern part of the Black Sea in the days leading up to the war. So the full-scale invasion, I should say. So maybe that's how they would proceed. But I don't, that's at least a tell of some sort, one would think, of what's happening there. Now, the other thing I would say is, the topography of Taiwan's interesting because it's very mountainous. And really only the western seaboard is suitable to an amphibious landing. The eastern part of the island is like mountains jutting out of the ocean, so you cannot land there. And I don't know. I'm told that this advantages the defense rather than the offense. I don't know if that's the case, but the Taiwanese are watching what's happening in the world. They're very interested in UAVs now, and they have a big, as I mentioned, indigenous submarine program, which might, some would argue, be a huge waste of money.
I was going to ask you that. You said the KMT might shut it down. You mean the KMT Parliament? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Why would they do that?
I'm not sure. Not because I'm not sure. I mean, my thinking would be it might be appropriate at this stage. I mean, I think maybe the investment is made and you just proceed a bit like the F-35, but it is very expensive to field a submarine, and I'm not sure how good they will be. That's a genuinely open question. It's not a statement. And if you can field like 4 of these and they're sunk, and that's a huge percentage of your military budget, it's curtains. Whereas like the U.S. still has an edge on submarine warfare over the PRC.
Maybe the smart thing is to put it all in drones.
They're in the attritable systems that like you just get a ton blown out of the sky, but if some of them.
Okay, so it's not. It doesn't necessarily have to be that the KMT is soft on China. That's why they.
This again gets at the point though that right, but this again gets at the point they don't know if the U.S. is going to come to their defense, and so they field some systems to fight alone if necessary. That if they were sure of U.S. support, maybe they would make different investment decisions. And, there is a natural symbiosis there. The Taiwanese are prepared to defend themselves at higher numbers if they believe the U.S. is willing to back them. If not, then their willingness to defend goes down substantially. Like the polling numbers are pretty clear about that. That's universal.
That's universal around the globe. And that's what our, for lack of a better word, isolationists need to realize. The restraintists that who habitually say our allies need to do more.
Yeah, and
our allies will do more.
Right.
But provided we're there.
And the flip side
they
of that
won't do more if we pull away, they'll do a lot.
Right.
Less.
And the flip side are the sort of Pollyannish liberal internationalists who speak universal values but aren't prepared to actually, or can't because it's impossible for American power to meet those statements and to actually cash those checks. And then when the bluff gets called, suddenly American credibility is at stake. And we've seen that as well. When we talk a big game, the bluff is called, and then if the U.S. doesn't act, it makes people like in Taiwan very nervous, which is why in part they are very nervous about the outcome in Ukraine, because they think Beijing is taking lessons from that.
Yeah, everybody's watching.
Yeah.
All right, Peter.
All right.
Wow. Thank you for
next week.
I'll
come on to talk about.
What are you going to enlighten us on next week?
Maybe Uganda.
Okay.
Maybe who knows? The Arctic.
All right. I look forward to
that. Yeah, it's been a real pleasure. Great show you've got, Mike.
It's the fastest growing podcast in the world. You know that?
I didn't know that. That's a factoid. Yeah.
And it's actually the fastest growing in numbers, but also we get very, very high level, very, very high level listeners, people with a lot of power and influence.
And including probably TechRow here in Washington. They're going to be pulling out their hair at all the wrong facts I've stated over the past hour, but thanks for having me on the trip.
Yeah, but there's a strategy behind all that. Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks.